the scale of Microsoft is just absurd. The fact that your code is going to be on every computer on Earth in a year. And at the same time, I was like, what if I screw it up?
Hey friends, this is Podcast Run by Software Engineer. I'm Perry Tiu, and on this episode I get to talk to Ramiro Berrelleza, founder and CEO of Okteto. Okteto is an online platform where a team of developers can automatically spin up development environments on the cloud, so they could all be coding in the same app configurations. Yes, even prod configs if you really wanted to. If you enjoy Podcast Run by Software Engineer, don't forget to follow the show so you don't miss out on the new episodes. And if you want to pick up some merch, go check it out at perrytiu.com/shop. Enjoy the episode. Welcome back to another episode of Podcast Run by Software Engineer. I'm your host Perry, and today I'm with Ramiro Berrelleza, founder and CEO of Okteto. Ramiro, how are you?
Hey Perry, excited to be on your podcast. How's it going?
Yeah, I'm doing good, thank you. I definitely think the excitement is reciprocated just because there's so much to talk about, and especially the space that you work in, I can't wait to dive into it. But more importantly, to really kick us off, who is Ramiro and what is Okteto?
That is a good question. Who is Ramiro? Ramiro is an engineer. That is my passion. I've been working in tech professionally for more than 20 years. But even before that, it's always, tech's always been one of the main things in my life. I was born in Mexico, grew up there, went to college in Mexico in the city of Guadalajara, and then moved to the US right after that. So, ever since I was a kid, tech is something that I was always amazed by, the power of creating and automating things. And, first it was video games. Then I started learning coding, or like quote unquote coding, like making websites and early JavaScript. And then eventually I got into like this kind of more like cloud computing and global services. But so I've always been very passionate about building things with tech. So whenever I think about who I am, that is one of the main kind of parts of my identity. I'm somebody who loves to use technology to solve problems. And, I've been lucky enough to work in a bunch of different places. Everything from like big tech, Microsoft, Atlassian, all the way to like small startups. And now Okteto, which is my own startup. First time I do a VC-backed startup. Before we tried, smaller companies, kind of more bootstrapped. This is the first VC-backed company, and Okteto is kind of like my answer to one of the biggest problems I've always had, which is, why is it so hard to get started to work? Every team I've worked at, every side project I've had, setting up your dev environment has always been very time consuming, very frustrating, especially now that applications are way more complex. You have microservices, APIs, more pieces. So Okteto is the answer to that. Okteto is a platform that automates the creation, management, configuration of dev environments for software teams of all sizes. And what we do differently is that in our case, the dev environments are no longer running on your laptop. They are running on the cloud. So they're ephemeral. They are, they can scale as much as you need them to. You can have as many as you want. And really my goal here is to make it as easy for developers and really everybody in the software development lifecycle, developers, designers, PMs, test, even like execs, to just have fun and be able to like focus on their thing rather than spend hours or days trying to like manually set up things. Which, I love working on this because it's a problem I've always had. So it's for me very natural to like tend towards, hey, I'm solving this for myself and also for a bunch of other people. And that makes it fun, excited, challenging, and in a way natural for me.
Yeah, you're not going out of your way to do this is what I'm understanding from here, just because, today we're lucky. We're not run by a single engineer, we're run by two engineers over here, because everything that I hear from you is very technical on a sense that we could definitely understand some of the struggles. Well, at least I can. I could definitely like bridge the gaps between why is it a problem to begin with, right? We're going to have so much time to think about, hey, why don't I have this problem, for example? But then when you're talking about the complexity behind it, the clouds, and then even like the concept of dot files, even that, for example, is something that you may relate to with everything that you're doing with Okteto, and dot files is like decades old, and that's something I could bring up. But these are all the topics I'm super excited to get into. You mentioned so many things about like early JS, which basically there was a world without React, there was a world without jQuery, there's a world without so many things that we're used to, and then I can't wait to get into that. But one of the highlights that you didn't mention is big shout out to where you came from, your hometown, where you grew up, Guadalajara. Not only for the tequila, but also nowadays I hear so much good tech coming out of it. I've worked actually with people based in Guadalajara, and that's something that I'm absolutely fascinated with. So
that is one of the coolest things, because when I was there, it was really hard to start your company there, especially to start a company with this kind of like global vision. Like, one thing that people don't know about Guadalajara is not very well known is Guadalajara actually has a lot of like entrepreneurs. Guadalajara is a city full of small and medium businesses in tech and in everything else, right? And since the 70s, 80s, Guadalajara became a tech kind of like center. IBM had a factory and a dev center there very early on. Intel and a bunch of like kind of like the more like car manufacturing, appliances manufacturing and design, chip design. Intel opened a chip design center there. So when I was in college, it was kind of like still early, but you kind of start seeing some of it. What was missing was this kind of like more global vision, the capital. So it's really exciting to see that now a lot of people that kind of did the same journey I did of like moving to the US, building their companies, then they came back, brought some of this know-how and the ambition with them. And now, as you're saying, we're seeing people working remotely from Guadalajara, startups having large teams there, some startups that are actually like based there now with like, US capital and kind of, and I find that super exciting. I'm actually going to be in Guadalajara in February. They invited me to speak at the first kind of official Kubernetes event, Kubernetes Community Days. Mexico's going to be in Guadalajara in February, and they invited me to go and keynote. And it's going to be so exciting to kind of go back to my hometown and kind of engage with the tech community and see all the stuff that's coming out of there. So it's really funny because it's a very traditional town, like when it comes to like culture, but it has this kind of like high tech side that I'm really keen to kind of re-engage and see firsthand and just gonna be part of.
Yeah, I mean the red carpet's gonna be ready. I mean, if anything, like good luck on the event. I'm sure you're absolutely gonna kill it just because you have so much experience behind you. One thing that you mentioned where it's like just coming back to your hometown, coming back to your roots and everything. I just wanted to ask in terms of what did that look like in the sense of did you have a lot of people around you doing tech growing up, for example? Did you have a lot of family members already like owning computers at a young age, or what did I guess like the influences in your childhood, whether it's from a person or like from a gadget or technology that you're playing with, I guess back then?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I grew up in the 80s, mid 80s, so there was not a lot of tech in Guadalajara in Mexico, right? Like Mexico was a bit behind the times, not like now. I mean, natural, there was no internet, any of those things. So for me, the entry point to tech were two kind of very clear things. One was video games. I remember when I got my first kind of like video game console and just the excitement, me and my brother of like, I remember it was like a Christmas, we had to run down to the tree, get the I think it was like a Nintendo or Super Nintendo. And it was just so exciting. Like, oh, like this electronic thing. So video games was a very early influence on getting into like tech. And the other was my dad worked at a bank. And in Mexico, banks were one of the first industries to be like fully digital. Like every employee had a computer and they were using computers for a bunch of things. So whenever we got a chance to kind of go and spend like a few hours at my dad's office, one of the biggest treats for me was, hey, you get to play with this computer. And back then playing was like, okay, you're typing things and you see them on the screen. You're printing, like word art, or like, you're putting data on like a spreadsheet and then you print it. And, now that's kind of like lame, but back then was this idea that, video games, you consume the entertainment. With computers, your whole input-output, that whole feedback loop really got me hooked into like, oh, wow, this is like something else. This is not just like like watching TV, which is interesting, and there's technology. This is me acting, creating something, and that for me was one of those. It's funny how you don't think of them as they happen, but when you look back, is one of those kind of fundamental steps in my life that because that happened, I think that enabled other things because nobody else in my family was really into technology. I'm the first kind of like nobody. I mean, now I have a couple of cousins who are studying, software engineering or CS. But back then, one of my aunts studied this degree they have in Mexico. It is kind of like called like something like I guess it translates to like business informatics. It's kind of like software engineering, but focus more on like for business, like how do you automate business processes, all those things. So she was a big influencer. But other than that, like my friends were all about video games, soccer, just running around doing like dumb things, and so that was kind of like the two-side thing that. And funny enough is that I still play video games today, so that kind of stuck with me. Like both things, tech and video games, stuck with me up to this day, and I still have I still play video games. I still code them on the side, and I have a company. But yeah, but that was kind of like the growing up. One of the most interesting things for me that I remember very fondly was when I got to college, when I finally actually got into like a school in Mexico, an engineering school. I was studying CS. That was the first time when I was surrounded by more kind of like kindred spirits, and it was another one of those interesting kind of like points. You're like, oh yeah, there's more people that like the things I like. It's really cool, and then you can talk about this very specific niche things about computers, about like, hey, I'm building my own computer. Which CPU do I put? How much memory? Which graphics card? Or hey, I'm learning to code this language. Have you tried X, Y? So it's really cool. So those things when I'm growing up and having access to computers early on, then getting into the CS school, were two very fundamental things that happened as I was growing up that I was very lucky to have access to because it was not that common in Mexico back then. Now it's completely different. Right now, like the internet has been this amazing way that it democratizes access everywhere. It's amazing. Back then it wasn't as easy, so I'm glad I got a chance to experience that and kind of go through it and understand the before and after.
No, yeah, absolutely. Some of the great words I threw out there's the words of like either luck or like encounters. There's the experience of never really understanding that you're treading new territories. When you're talking about not that many people around you were doing tech, but then you kind of have these exposure, these glimpses of tech, and then of course you nowadays you do so much tech. I keep on saying the part where everybody gets into tech differently, and for me to hear you describe how those influences grew up, that's what I like hearing. Just because I can tell my story, it's gonna take another hour, but we'll do that next time. One thing that you just started talking about, and I was like, tell me more about, speak to me about this. I want to hear all about it. The video game world, in the sense of, I do games sometimes, not as much as I do back then, but one thing that I do know growing up, maybe that you could relate to, is I learned so much English playing video games. People don't, oh my God, I don't know if people know this about me, but I'm from Montreal originally. First language I learned, of course, is Cantonese. That's what we speak at home. But also Montreal is very French, so I went to school in French and everything. So French was my second language, and then English was my third. And people keep on asking me, how did you learn English? And I'm sure you can probably relate, is video games, right?
Big time. Yeah, no, you're completely right. Like for me, video games and tabletop role-playing games, which is another of my lifelong passions, like Dungeons and Dragons, all those things. Those two forced me to learn English, because it was like all the like with video games, right? The games, and I always liked history-based like role-playing games where you have to like read a lot and understand what is like the very first. I don't know, like I remember playing one of her first Zeldas or Final Fantasy where you had to read a lot. And it was like, what does that word mean? Like, what is this? What is that? And yeah, that opened a door because that is the other aspect. I'm glad you mentioned it. Like for me, being fluent in English by the time I was in college opened another world of possibilities because thanks to that, I was able to like move to the US, work at Microsoft. Before Microsoft, I had an internship at IBM in the US as well. And a big part of why I got the internship was because you're one of the ones who can be successful in an English, like in the US, in a part of the US, Minnesota, where there's not a lot of Spanish speakers. California is a whole different story. You can live here without speaking English, but not in Minnesota. And yeah, that was a big edge that at the time I would have never guessed that, hey, these things, my love for video games, for Dungeons and Dragons, took me to English. That actually helped me get into a better school, which then helped me to get into like this industry. I know I said earlier about luck, and I think luck always plays a big aspect of this, but something I always tell people is that I love that phrase where like you have to be ready when luck strikes, and you have to be willing to make the choices when luck strikes. I think that's very important to consider. It's not just you're not sitting waiting for things to happen, but it's true that for a lot of us, if X or Y hadn't happened, my life would have been a very different trajectory. I think I would have still been tech, but maybe it was in Mexico, maybe it was somewhere else. Who knows?
Hey, I mean, luck favors the prepared mind, if I got that correctly.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, that's a good one.
One of the best analogy I remember seeing is somebody was saying that, hey, we all live under trees, and apples will always fall from trees. You just got to position yourself to catch them at the right time. So a lot of that is really, really fun to hear from you, just because when you're even barely describing how you have influences going into tech, like you could see a lot of that reflect into it. There's another great thing that you mentioned is you found your people at some point in computer science. You found your people in the sense of you're doing techie stuff, getting into it, and this is the people describe going from high school to university kind of like getting into the bigger leagues, the big leagues, right? Where it's like there's a bigger, I guess, audience of people like-minded. So I also did comp sci, and I definitely want to hear from your perspective in terms of like the differences. I did it in McGill University in Montreal, a very, very fun, very, very different environment. But from you going into it, you were mentioning how, of course, you had a bit of background in video games, but what about other backgrounds? Well, I mean, background in video games, and of course, like just being a human at that point. Yeah, going into that, what else did you find yourself like relying on? What skills that you have, what qualities that you have going into comp sci? Did you already know a bit of programming before then? Did you already know a bit of math before then, or was it really just a hey, comp sci, or even why comp sci?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I didn't have any like programming experience before when I finished high school. What happened to me was after high school, I took a year off, like a gap year, and I moved I had family in the U.S., so I decided, hey, let's go for 6 months. I'll hang out with my cousins. They were very gracious to like invite me to live with them for 6 months. So in those 6 months, two things happened. One is I enrolled in some kind of like English as a second language classes, which helped me kind of finally like polish. It's very different when you have like textbook English compared to like, okay, now you're actually speaking with like native speakers, and it's like a whole different thing. So it helped me kind of like finally go over that hump. And the other was that, this was in Ohio. In Ohio, it snows a lot. First time I ever saw snow. So there's not a lot of things you can do in the winter. So one day, I was at a mall, and I went to Barnes and Nobles, which was this store where they sell books. For those of you who were not around back then, this huge store. But one of the really cool things about Barnes and Nobles was it had a whole section on like computer books, which was something I've never seen before. In Mexico, it was still more of a niche. You had to go to like the very specialized stores. And one day I was there, and I really like books. I like to read, so I was always kind of like hanging out there, checking out books. And I saw that they were selling this book for like $5, like hey, HTML and CSS programming. And I was like, okay, why not? Let's pick it up. It's cheap. It was kind of like doing when they put those books at the table on your way out. I pick it up. It was cheap. I bought it. So during those 6-8 months I was in Ohio, I spent a lot of time kind of just reading that book and learning the fundamentals of like web site building. Right? And it's like very primitive. This is way before jQuery. This is just like pure vanilla HTML and CSS. I think it was one. But that kind of gave me the opportunity to start to realize that, hey, I have affinities for this. I get it. And it kind of felt easy for me. And more than easy, it was like, hey, I like this. I'm willing to put the work. Like, I didn't mind spending a few hours and getting it wrong and trying it out. And one of the things I really love about that time was that the feedback loop of building a website is super fast, right? You open the text editor, You put the brackets, whatever, you save, you go to browser, you reload, and you see it. And you can, and this is really cool. Like you tinker with it, you add some stuff. So anyway, this kind of got me into like, oh yeah, I kind of like this. So I went back to school. I applied for this school, Tec de Monterrey, which is one of the top schools in Mexico. It's very focused on engineering, which I really liked. And I got in. I always got good grades, so it was kind of easy to get in. And then when I had to pick my degree, I was like, yeah, I like programming, I guess. I was back then. I was trying to figure it out between electrical engineering or computer science. So I talked to a few of the people in the schools, and kudos to Tec de Monterrey because they were really good at like helping you figure out, hey, do you really like this thing? and I ended up in CS, and it was like great. I found my people, and I always found it super exciting, so it felt easy for me. And as I learned, and I had no formal training, right? It was just kind of like one book I read. So then when I got my first kind of like classes on like programming, object-oriented programming, databases, functional programming, it just felt natural to me. So I was excited. You get the good grades, which is always a good motivation to kind of keep going. And that just got me into this kind of like virtuous cycle where I was just learning, getting good feedback, building good friendships with other people who also like the same things I like, and it just kind of kept me going until I got my degree, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, number one, shout out to the football team, Monterrey. I see them in MX La Liga sometimes, and it's really, really fun to catch them over there. But
yeah,
aside from that, I don't know if you're an actual fan of them, but either way, the other part that I was actually really shocked and really jealous and really impressed by you're talking about the 6-month stay, right? It impacted so much of what you do today, of being able to, even that encounter of picking up that book, that $5 book of learning about stuff. Like, it really takes a combination of luck, of will, of any kind of thing that people could think of to get through that. And I hope you send them Christmas cards every year, that the people that let you stay with them, because it seems very life changing.
Now I feel guilty. I should do more. But you're right. It's those moments when like it's fascinating when you go through them, and then like you look back and you're like, oh yeah, that led to this, led to that. Mm-hmm. And people always say that like careers are made only in retrospective. But it's funny how everything we're talking about, I can map it to why I'm doing what I'm doing today. And that to me is like super.
And trust me, there's a lot of people benefiting from it. So that's why I want to get to that part on that. One thing I just want to double check with you on the comes to that degree part is we usually have like a capstone project. People call it capstone. We didn't call it capstone back then. It was kind of like a project that you did, kind of to encapsulate what you learned. I mean, similarly, by the way, when you mentioned database, like object-oriented programming and all that kind of stuff, we did a lot of the algorithms when I was in university, did a lot of that. But do you remember what was your project that you came out of that degree with?
Yeah. It has nothing to do with what I do now.
That's great.
But my capstone project. So you had to do that in Mexico. Mexico, they still follow kind of like the old school model of like you have to do either a thesis, like a book where you write, or Tec de Monterrey being an engineering school, they were like, or you do like a big engineering project. So my project was, I was really into natural language processing, and AI in my last couple years at school. So my capstone project was the system to translate between Spanish and a series of like native Mexican languages. Like there's still people in Mexico who speak the language of the Mayans and the language of the Aztecs, and there's other communities that's all they speak. So it was a research project where we were like building the kind of like neural networks and the whole model to translate from Spanish to that. Which, funny enough, is the fundamentals of what LLMs do now. I mean, that was like, It's funny because the theory is the same. Of course, the compute power is like 1 billion times stronger, so now it actually works well. But back then, it was very funny that these early things we were like trying out ended up being kind of some of the building blocks that now we use when we were using ChatGPT. But yeah, that was my capstone project. It was very fun. It was a team of 3 good friends of mine and this professor who had like a AI PhD. And yeah, that was mine. What was yours? I'm curious, what was yours?
Yeah, thanks for asking on that one. And even just story, I'm jealous. Mine isn't as good. I think a lot of our capstone project was related to video games, funny enough, because Montreal is a big video game city. A lot of the Ubisoft and a lot of these Rockstars, the Square Enix, they're headquartered in Montreal, or at least they're still. I don't know. Maybe they're still headquartered there. We ended up doing, what is it, like a Unity project. It was Unity project plus C#, and you were rendering some tiles. You're doing a lot of that. So I think, from what I remember, that was the biggest project that I worked on when I was in university.
Cool. That sounds really cool. I'm kind of jealous that I didn't get to play with those things.
It was cool in the sense of, it was cool if you understood what you were doing. And unfortunately, like 96% of us had no idea what we were doing. So it was a lot of it. And that's when you learn, like, as a team, like, there are people who do better in a team and people who do worse on the team. And trust me, I'm definitely on the latter one.
Yeah, no, that's I'm sure it's not true. But that's such something that, yeah, like, if you learn that early enough and don't forget it, that's something that is key to teams. Even now, is I don't believe in like the 10x engineer. But I know there are people who are like substantially better than the rest. And if you put them together, magic happens. And when I look back at these projects, because another project I did that wasn't the official capstone, was one of those kind of like life-changing things for me. Speaking of .NET, actually, is Microsoft organizes this thing called Imagine Cup. It's a worldwide student competition where students kind of pitch projects. First at the school level, then at like the country level, and then like a national, like a worldwide thing. And we did a project on electronic medical records on .NET. That's how I learned .NET. And we won the school level, we won the Mexico level, and then we went to present in India, right? Like a friend of mine. And what was really cool about that was what you were saying is like, this was like some of my best friends. Actually, Ivan is still my closest friend. We just had lunch yesterday. He lives here in California, and he lives in Mountain View in Sunnyvale, actually. And what's really cool was like we were building this on the side, but because we started to get all this recognition, we ended up getting recruited by Microsoft. So this not capstone project, but this project we actually spent a lot of time on the side ended up being more meaningful. And what's really funny was that we were also doing in .NET, a lot of those early technologies, and that ended up taking me in that first phase of my career, which was working for Microsoft.
Yeah, I'm. This is a perfect segue because we're gonna dive into bridging that gap between graduating from university and going all into what you're doing today. And shout out to side projects. I also got my first job because I was working on a side project. So anybody listening to this, like, in school, whatever you do a side project. It could be dumb. It could be the dumbest thing on the planet. Trust me, it's better than not doing it.
Oh, it's fundamental. That's the thing that, I mean, I think it has changed now. But when I was in school, like, I learned a lot during school. I think I learned a lot of the fundamentals at college, but nothing I've done professionally was really learned at school. And those side projects taught me everything, like cloud computing, .NET in the beginning, then Python, Go, Kubernetes, like everything I've done in my career, it's been kind of on the side. And then you apply it professionally. But at school, yes. Open source, side projects are like important things. Especially because in college, it doesn't look that way. But you have so much free time. We always feel like the pressure, like we're there, we have to work hard. But we all have free time. You're in college, you're listening to this, you have free time. Put it to good use, do something fun. But yeah, those side projects are key to like really building deep expertise, or whether it's deep or wide, but expertise in things that are not going to be the core of your education, but that are important as you move into the professional life.
No, definitely breadth versus depth of knowledge all the time. But one thing that you've kind of alluded already to in terms of working for big tech, working for small tech, all that kind of stuff, you are seasoned at the end of the day, just like probably a lot of other folks. And this is why we're very lucky to hear. Even just an overview, going to Microsoft, and I believe you went to Elastic Box after, and then at Atlassian. That's something that people love to see and hear about, mostly from the engineering side, because people do tech very, very differently at each one of these. So I'm trying to see if I could bridge a gap between how you use your, I guess, engineering skills in all of those three and how it helps you today. So I think you mentioned that you were recruited to go to Microsoft, in the sense of, was there already an area specific that you wanted, or they know you wanted to work on, or did you already ask for an area to be like, I want to specifically touch the OS, or I want to specifically touch this part of it? How did that transition went from, hey, I'm no longer a student, and boom, I'm a full-time Employee.
That's a funny story because I never really thought about either moving to the US or joining Microsoft. In school, I was like, for the longest time, very kind of hardcore open source Linux, like commercial software is evil, kind of like, college level naivete. But it was fun. At some point, as I said, through this kind of student competitions, I got involved in the .NET world. I really liked the language. Then I learned more of the Microsoft stack, and I liked it. The way Microsoft recruited back then, and I think Google does the same thing, was not really about a specific teams. It was more about like, hey, come interview at Microsoft. So we went, my friend Ivan and I got two other friends back on. We went to the US, went to Seattle. I remember this like very rainy weekend. And you just kind of went into a room. There was like 100 other people. And there's all those like interview rounds. And people just interview you from like different organizations, from everything, right? And then at the end of the day, if you pass interviews, they were kind of like, some people were like, okay, you guys go home, go to the hotel, have fun. There's like a dinner later, enjoy. It's paid for. And a few of us like, okay, the 10, 20 you, please join us in this other room. And of course we were like, okay, I guess they're gonna like send us back right now, whatever. And then they told us, hey, no, congrats, we'd like to make you an offer. In the next few days, you're gonna get an email explaining like which teams I want to make you an offer. And what happened was that a bunch of different teams, they will kind of like just figure it out based on your skills, I guess, and based on their needs, where would you fit? And I got offers from Office and from the .NET Framework team. And then my friend Ivan got offers from .NET Framework team and from Hotmail. So it was kind of like everywhere, right? This was back when Hotmail was big, when they were trying to build live.com. So I ended up picking .NET because that's kind of, I like the framework, it's really cool. My friend ended up going to live.com. And what happened there was that, and another one of those kind of like lucky breaks, I joined the .NET team, very fun. And one thing I like about big tech is Microsoft is really good at engineering. And that was for me, I was there for 4 years. It was kind of like the process of coming from like, I have a CS degree to like, I know how to build software commercially. Because it's very different, right? Like you go from like, I know how to solve problems to, hey, you have to solve problems on a specific time. You have to prioritize and it's something that Microsoft did really well back then. It was like, hey, we have to ship things on a specific date. And that date is not going to move no matter what. Like you can cut down scope, you can drop features, the date will not move. And that taught me a lot of like things like, hey, at some point you're going to be okay. You're going to ship bugs and they're there. And you're going to do it because there's no choice. We have commercial responsibilities. We have back then, hey, we have to send the binaries, and back then was like to China, so they can print the DVDs for Windows, so they can ship them back on a boat to the US, so they are available for release on like X date, right? So that taught me so much. And the other thing was how once you build these core engineering skills, you can work on very different things. Because I was working with .NET Framework on the REST and SOAP libraries for like REST APIs. And then Microsoft changed priorities, and then Azure became the main thing. So they took all of us who were building and networking a stack for the framework. Hey, you're now Azure. You're going to build this cloud service. One, I was very lucky to be there at kind of like the early days of cloud services at Microsoft. I learned a lot about like cloud infra, scale, how do you build this kind of cloud native services. But the other was to learn, hey, you can change from one product to another, and you're not starting from zero. And that's been cool because now, as I've changed companies, changed products, I no longer have that concern. Like, oh, it's a different programming language. Oh, it's a different platform. I'm like, yeah, okay. I have a base. I have core skills that can be applied in different areas. Of course, I have some areas of a specialty, but I could join a team doing something else, and I've done it. Where like I was at Microsoft building cloud services. I went to Elasticbox to build a DevOps kind of SaaS platform. Then I went to Atlassian to build a chat product, HipChat. Um, so some skills move with me, but I had to pick up another set of skills, and that's something I learned at Microsoft that was like really really cool, and that idea of engineering as a craft, as something that you have to understand, that you have to care about it, you have to like polish things, you have to learn how to like work as a team, communication, you have to convince other people. It's not just writing code. Like software engineering is a social, like the code is actually kind of the easiest, kind of the last thing, right? You have to build all these other things first. That's something I learned at Microsoft that was I was not expecting, and it helped me a ton as I kind of started to like build a career. When I post college, I was very naive college student. You think you know everything, and then you realize, hey, I know some things, but there's so much more I need to learn.
I am absolutely fascinated. Everything that you've mentioned so far, even the part that you're talking about using SOAP to build even other kind of frameworks and even kind of features to be able to use that. Like of course, REST is kind of king nowadays. There's a GraphQL, there's all the other ones that are out there, the RPCs and everything. But even you mentioning SOAP and how that's being used, like those are really just cool stories from internally over there. And even we're gonna get to the part, of course, like you won't be doing what you are doing today without this experience, right? You won't be the founder that you are. You won't be the entrepreneur that you are today without any of that. This is actually a very particular random question, but what was it like in terms of sprint versus waterfall versus any other methods of delivering stuff at Microsoft? Was it like the dates? Was it you got to deliver this every 2 weeks, or was it something like we have 3 months to do this because maybe the binaries or maybe the versions of the Windows versions were longer? So I don't know exactly what was the best way to describe it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this was years ago, so I'm sure it has changed. But back then, there were like very long release cycles because the .NET framework release cycle was tied up to Windows. That was the main, like, .NET was the core of Windows. They shipped together. And Windows back then had a 2-year release cycle. So they were very long. They were like quarterly internal releases. Back then it was kind of like the RC release and beta. So internally, the planning, there was like this kind of waterfally where like there was like a very large, big plan. Okay, the next 2 years, this is the goal. And I remember every time we ship Windows, a version, right? There were like 2 months when like there was nothing to do because everybody was working on planning. So that was the 2 months. We're like, okay, we're gonna fix our tests. We're gonna like, oh yeah, we were waiting to like build this internal tool. Okay, do it now. We're gonna clean up all of our bugs and delete things we're never gonna get to. Okay, so it was kind of like the clean up, get ready for for the next season kind of thing. But it was long. I remember it felt like, but what I remember though, it didn't feel long because it was very well organized. Like this very draconian date, and this very what I like was it was draconian in the sense of like the date would not move, no matter what. The date will not move. So what would move was like what are we shipping, and having the clarity of like, hey, if your project is not done by this date, and Microsoft was really good at defining. And that's something I learned, and I always try to push my teams, is the definition of done. Have it as clear as possible. And for Microsoft, was like, okay, you have these 10 features. They need to have all test passing of this priority and this review design and X, Y, and Z, right? And that was really cool because it was very clear. And you're like, hey, are we going to make it or not? So having those hard deadlines also gave you this kind of like, the whole spirit's the corpse, where like everybody's kind of working together towards a common goal of like, we have to get this done. And you could see how everybody in the building, the month before the deadline, slowly people will be staying later and later. But it was very exciting because people were like really pushing, and Microsoft had a really good work-life balance. So we all knew that, okay, there are times when you push hard, and then there'll be times when you're like taking it easy. The summer was like always like, okay, let's take it easy, play sports outside, don't worry too much. So that was really cool. I learned that. Sometimes I love the fact that now we release multiple times per day, but I do miss the feeling of like, hey, there's this big deadline. Let's pull together to make it happen. And it's very clear if you make it or not. And when you do, I remember those like shipping parties, which were like simple, hey, pizza and beer, whatever. But the feeling of like, oh, we did it. It's amazing. We shipped what we promised, and it's done. That was something that was really exciting. I remember the first few of those. I was kind of like not even believing it. Like, wow, like actually I worked on this thing that the scale of Microsoft is just absurd. The fact that your code was like, oh yeah, this kind of code I wrote is going to be on every computer on Earth in a year. I was like, what? Oh yeah, every computer. That was like the scale was like fascinating, and at the same time, I was like, I can't believe this. Like, wow, what if I screw it up? What if it fails? Like everyone's gonna be affected. But that was really cool, and the scale for me was eye opening of like, oh, you can do things at global scale. You can do things that affect, and you don't have to feel one scared, and two, it's not that different from making things. At the end of the day, it's the same code. It's just a distribution that's bigger, right? But it's exciting, and as we think of Okteto and our startup now, keeping that motivation, keeping that vision of like, hey, you're affecting you're changing the world. It's something that's very important that I learned there that I try to keep. It's not easy to keep, and you have to kind of remind yourself and remind the team. But it is something that I learned in the early days that changed how I thought about software and change. I always envy that from people who went to school in the US. I think that, and probably Canada as well, where like the ambition is something that is kind of like baked in. Mexico back then was more like, hey, like curve don't go too far, realize kind of where you're coming from. And here's like, no, you can do whatever. Yeah, you can build something that's world changing while at school. That's amazing, and something that I think all of us founders need to like continually encourage, especially as we move to like global startups where like my company has employees in 7-8 countries now, and different cultures. So I always remember that, and I try to like somehow impress this on everybody, because it's real. Like, you can't build software that changes the world. Like we have customers in like 10-15 countries now, and that's something I learned there that I still find fascinating, like the scope of software, how far it can get. But what I recommend everybody is yeah, I think it's a good idea to go work for a big company for a bit. I don't think I could be in startups if I hadn't done that. Maybe other people are smarter than me, but for me, like when I learned there, I'm still reaping the benefits.
Yeah, it's so great to hear from you how you put that into perspective. And there's a bit of irony behind it in the sense of like work for big tech so you know how it feels like in a startup. There's always that irony, but at the same time, it's really funny to think about it.
I mean, it's also, yeah. I mean, that's another point that I went from Microsoft, 200,000 people when I was there, to Elastic Box, which was founded by a couple of my friends that I met at Microsoft. It was 5 people. So the shock of like, you are part of a team that is part of a division that is part of a product line, to, hey, it's 5 people, we're building this, that's it. I love that transition. It was brutal. It's kind of like when you jump into like a very cold lake, and you kind of like those first few seconds when you're like, am I gonna die? I can't breathe. Like I remember I went from like coding on Windows.net to like, hey, we're using Macs and we're coding on Python. Okay, how do I use a Mac? How do I copy paste on a Mac? Like it was tough at the beginning, but I think having that experience as well helped me to kind of like show me that, yeah, you can do it. Yeah, it's a tough month, and that's it. And then you just kind of pick up where you were. So it was a cool transition. I'm glad it happened, because now I also know the difference, and that's something that when I hire people who come from big companies, that is something that's important to always measure. Is, hey, are these people aware of the difference? Because a lot of the things I love about Microsoft are like structure, hard deadlines. If you try to apply that to an early startup, you're going to kill it. Because that makes sense when you know what you're shipping, when you have Windows and it's been shipping for years, and it's very clear what's coming next, and the risk is very high of getting it wrong. You don't want to break 300 million computers. If Windows has an issue, startups are not like that. So knowing that, understanding what makes sense of these more mature engineering practices, what you need to avoid, what you need to like actively push against is important. And I've seen a lot of people who go from big tech to startups because they want to be, you want to have more ownership and more impact. And they don't realize this difference and they're not successful. And very quickly you see them go back to, I don't know why I've seen people at Google suffer to this the most. I've never worked there, so I don't know what is it inside, but I've seen a lot of people from Google who go from Google to startups and, like 3 months later, they're back at Google. Because, it's very different. And I think having experience in both is rich, but it is different.
It's because they missed the tools. I'm kidding.
I've heard that.
It's because they missed the tools.
I've
it's
heard
the
that
people
a
at
lot.
Facebook missing the tools as well. Every time they leave, we don't have Gatekeeper. We don't have anything anymore.
But to their benefit, there's so many startups, especially in developer tools, that all they're doing is taking these tools that Google had and making them for everybody else. Us, to a degree, because one of my co-founders, Ramon, worked at Google for a while. Some of the early ideas of Okteto came from Ramon was like, hey, I have this remote dev environment. It's amazing. I don't have to install anything. It just works. And some of the ideas, some of the experience he learned that definitely impact what we're doing. So, there is a point of benefit of seeing how these massive companies build software. But I always have to remind people, hey, the Google scale of problems, the Microsoft scale of problems is not the normal company scale of problems. So it's very different. You have to be very careful of which practices you want to bring in. And I've been guilty of that, like setting up very complex CI systems on day one, building architectures for thousands of concurrent users when you don't have a single user. We're all guilty of this because it's fun to build for a scale, but you have to be very present of what do you need for your size, and that's something I've learned by both being in big tech and then kind of moving to startups. And they're very different, so it really depends on what you like.
Yeah, this ties back to the fact that you're saying what is considered done, right? Because done is it's a moving goalpost. There's always a done part. So every time you mention in terms of what is included in this release, what is not included in this is super important. Even from your perspective, even from my perspective, I've worked on a lot of different things, and you got to say, hey, this is not part of the release. So,
it's the hardest thing, but it's one of the most important things to do is actively choosing, hey, we're not going to do this right now, and be disciplined.
And the cool part is, I want to jump into the story of Okteto and Hanfan. Actually, the last part I want to, maybe this question I'm always curious before we get into the founding story of Okteto and everything. That's the great part. Related to the jump from big tech, Microsoft, all the way to Elasticbox and then Atlassian. The jump from, you're talking about big tech of diving into something new, fresh, that has a little bit more freedom, a little bit running around everywhere, a little bit wearing all different hats. Was that also the same appeal, the same reason when you went from Elasticbox to Atlassian? As in, did you have the same feeling jumping from Microsoft to Elasticbox, similar to Elasticbox all the way to Atlassian as well?
A little bit. So when I left Elasticbox, it was a tough experience. It was kind of burnout. It was startup, not a lot of capital. You have to invent a lot of things. It was a lot of pressure, many hats. Ended up when I moved to Atlassian, there were 2 things I was looking for. One was hey, I want to work on something that is not developer tools. I want to try something different. The appeal of Atlassian was hey, I want to work on something that I can explain to my family what do I do. It's something I know people that use it. But I still wanted to hey, work on something cool. And I ended up in Atlassian because my manager there, Musa, was somebody that I actually, Elasticbox interviewed to be our VP of Eng. Didn't work out. He ended up going to Atlassian. But when him and I kind of interview each other at Elasticbox, it kind of I don't know, we kind of remembered each other. So when I was looking for a job, actually the CEO of Elasticbox put me in touch with Musa. He was like, oh yeah, Musa was very impressed with you when you interviewed. You should talk to him. He's building a new team. Okay, sure. And I met him, and then I met the team. And going back to what you're saying earlier about kind of these very strong teams, you can tell, that was what impressed me. Was wow, these people. I did this loop of interview with 5-6 people at the HipChat team at Atlassian, and I was impressed by how good they were. The level of interview, the level of conversation, what they were asking me was like, oh yeah, this is not like this is real. And I was very excited to work on something new. HipChat was kind of like the OG chat product that was before Slack, before Teams. So it's kind of like, hey, this is new. I've used HipChat before. I like it. It's kind of like trendy. And to my eternal shame, I had no idea how big Atlassian was. I've never used Jira before. I had no idea what Jira was. And I joined. I was like, oh, this company is doing really well. Oh, yeah, of course. Let's make it Jira. Oh, Jira. Oh, that ticket thing. Yeah. So like, okay, cool. But I joined because of HipChat. I didn't join because of Atlassian. And the other thing that I really liked back then was that, and it's something I really like of like high scale-ups, like startups at high growth, is when they still feel like startups, you still have a lot of agency, but they're growing fast. And that happened to us. Like I joined Atlassian, we were like, I think 800 people. By the time I left 4 years later, we're like 5,000 people. So it's this massive scale. So I joined early enough that I had enough agency that I just did things myself and like, hey, we need to fix this. Okay, go fix it. But now we had the resources to, hey, we need to build a team. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, let's build this team. Oh yeah, we have to build this tooling. Okay, go ahead and build that tooling. So it was different in that way, like kind of like mid-size, kind of high growth. But I still, if I were to look for a job now, like this sense of like high agency, that you have clear ownership of a piece, is something I would look for. And in retrospect, what I didn't realize about Microsoft was that because I was in Azure, which was a brand new product, we had a lot more freedom that my friends who were working at like Office or at even Xbox, that was a lot more like control. So finding this mix of like resources, high agency, you're building something that is cool, that you enjoy, that's always the sweet spot I'm looking for. And I found that at Atlassian. And it was like a fantastic 4 years there. It was like so much fun.
No, that's really great to hear. When you mentioned about the products of Atlassian, right? The Jiras, I think the other popular one now that you got Confluence, pretty popular. Trello's pretty popular. I think they acquired Trello more than building it. But
they acquired Trello. Trello was came out of a Fog Creek in New York.
Yeah, so these are tools that people in tech at least are familiar with. So shout out to all those. You've helped a lot of people out there. One thing that people also should know is Atlassian, I think they're based in Australia?
Yeah.
Question mark? They're headquartered in
Australian the founders are from Australia and Sydney. The main office is there. And that was something also that I think was super interesting of how different the culture at Atlassian was compared to like the Bay Area kind of attitude. Like a lot more balanced, a lot more like chill. Like the Australian chillness somehow permeated like even like the US offices. It wasn't as Australia. You can still sense the differences. But yeah, that was very interesting. It was really cool. And I learned a lot about, it's the first company I saw where like I really felt like everybody lived the company values. Like they were very important. I still remember them. And they had them printed on the wall and whatever. Like every company, right? But they were not like BS. They were like, no, actually, people do make decisions based on the values. People challenge each other in a positive way using the company values. I was like, wow, that's really cool. Like it was a very open company. Like it was so open that when Atlassian IPO'd, the SEC kind of determined that, hey, every Atlassian is considered an insider trader because you all have so much information. So there were like rules you had to set. And that was like, to me, was like amazing. Like I could go and see like the finance of the company. It was in an internal conference instance, roadmaps, anything that was not kind of HR was open by default. So that changed the culture. It was like less secrecy, less about execs trying to like one up each other, and more about like this. I felt it was very harmonic. Maybe I didn't see the bad parts. There's always politics, but it was very interesting how the culture, I think, enabled, because it was a company building collaboration tools. Having your culture be all about collaboration, I think, creates this virtuous cycle of like, hey, we're collaborating well. We know how to collaborate well. We can build this into our products and show the world how to do it.
Yeah, that's something that I learned today. That's something that when you mentioned that internally they were capable, they are capable of sharing so much transparency. Even as an employee at different companies, like I've always been like, when can I know that how we're doing in the company? When can I see the direct finances and everything? I feel like some of these examples, some of these, I guess, stories that you're mentioning is that it's possible out there, and that's why people benefit from them at the end. With one part to this of so much culture, so much baggage, when you're talking about even working with Australians, but also working with all the different, parts of the world and piece of technology, is you took that and you ran with it. You took that and you went on and, well, today, Okteto. I want to hear the founding story behind. I want to hear about the whole part, because that's definitely the meat of the interest, well, at least for me right now, is where did the name come from? Where did the idea come from? Like, let's start with the name. Like, where did that come from, and how did you and two other co-founders get to that?
Yeah, so before the name, let me tell you a story, because it kind of, everything will make sense at the end. So when I was in Elastic Box, when I got hired, another engineer, Pablo, was hired. Pablo's from Spain. So we were kind of like the two engineers building the product, while the founders were like out there trying to get customers, fundraising, kind of having the strategy of the company, all that stuff, right? So Pablo and I were like early days building everything ourselves. We became really good friends. After Elasticbox kind of got acquired by CenturyLink, Pablo went back to Spain. I stayed in San Francisco. Also during Elasticbox, through a common friend, I met Ramon, my other co-founder. Ramon is also Spanish. He was working at Google after Elasticbox. Then he moved to Zurich to work at, Google has an office in Zurich. They were building Inbox in Zurich, I think. But, we liked working together. We had fun. We became really good friends. So we kind of kept talking, hey, we should do something together. But, it never happened. We're all kind of like building our own things. And at some point, Ramon was here in San Francisco. We were having beers at this place called Zeitgeist, which is a very iconic beer bar in San Francisco.
I've been there.
See, I love that place.
The backyard is amazing.
Exactly, in the backyard. So we're sitting there. And Ramon was like, okay, we have to either stop talking about doing things together or do it, because, I'm not that happy anymore. I want to either change teams or change jobs. But if we're going to do this, I'd rather do it now. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Okay, let's do it. And then we kind of like talked to Pablo, and then we kind of said, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to give us this. We're going to start working on ideas. Let's not quit yet. Let's work on ideas in our spare time, kind of build a few side projects to figure out what we want to do. And then when we know, okay, then we'll quit. And then we spent like 6 months, and it was really funny because we had the team first, but we didn't have any idea what we were going to build. And our first kind of idea was like, hey, let's not do developer tools. Let's do something new. Okay, what about blockchain? That's cool, it's new. Okay, sure, why not? So we're like starting to do some research and building some things. And after a couple months, we're like, yeah, you know what? I don't know about this. It's not that cool. It doesn't appeal to me. Yeah, you're right. Okay, let's do something else. Okay, how about BR? Oh yeah, BR, that's cool. And then we kind of spent a few more months building BR. They didn't really like found something. We even joined at some point like this kind of like incubator, because we had this idea of like doing BR for like supermarkets to kind of help supermarkets model how the stores are laid out and things like that. We had no idea. We joined this incubator. We realized, and it was actually this incubator sponsored by like a Spanish grocery store chain, so it was like a good fit. But then we realized, hey, this is like so boring. Like I don't want to work with like the supermarket. Like building software for supermarkets was like the process. It's kind of like government, right? A very long process. You can't really do it as a startup. You have to be part of the company. So we didn't have like the connection, like the network there. So like, hey, this is not for us. And then eventually we were like, hey, we keep going circles about this, but we've never done a startup. We like developer tools. We know how to build developer tools. Let's just like increase our chances of success by at least knowing one thing. So we started building things developer tools. And Pablo and I, he was a Docker at the time. I was at Atlassian. We were both trying to start to get, we've been using containers for a while. But there was this new tool that started at Google called Kubernetes that was just recently open sourced. And we both knew, hey, this Kubernetes thing, it solves all the problems we have of this kind of class. It's going to be a big thing. But he was like, yeah, that's right. And I was like, yeah, but it sucks to use. It's so hard to develop. He was like, yeah, I hate it. So then it was like, okay, that clicked. Say, hey, maybe what we should do is tools to make Kubernetes easier for developers. And we're like, yes, that's it. And we built this small open source project still around. Now it's our CLI. We went to a few meetups, got some really good, when you go to a meetup and you end the meetup and you have a discussion with somebody that disagrees very strongly with your idea, that's when you know you're into something, because you're touching on something that is creating a passionate reaction, either positive or negative. It's like, okay, we're onto something here. People care about this problem. Amazing. So that's when we said, okay, let's quit. Up to that point, the company was called Rivera Project, because Pablo, his family has a house in southern Spain in the beach. So the whole idea was like, hey, once we know what we want to build, we're going to go to your beach house, spend the summer there, build something. If it works, amazing. If it doesn't work, well, we spend 3 months in the beach in southern Spain. So it's all good. So then that was kind of the first thing. Then we had something we knew we wanted to build. We kind of built the open source project. We had some kind of early promises. And one of our mentors, Daniel Lopez, the founder of Bitnami, said, hey, we kind of pitched him on our idea. He said, hey, this makes a lot of sense. I like it. He was like, 2 things. Change the name of the project, because that name's stupid. I mean, he said that, but it was like, hey, it's stupid. Like, don't call it project. Call it like something real. And second, you should join Y Combinator. You should apply to. Like, I went through it. I learned a lot. You're kind of the same as I was. Engineers with no business background. It will help you figure out what building a company actually means, and not just building software. So then I was in Spain. Then I spent a few months in Spain, and we were trying to figure out the name. And one of the things they always tell you is you have to find a name that is short, easy to spell, and that the .com is available, that the GitHub organization is available, and the Twitter handle is available. I'm like, we tried a bunch of things, and we couldn't find anything. And then one day, Ramon came up with a list of things, and one of the names was Okteto. What's funny about Okteto is that when Pablo, Ramon, and I went, we're kind of the same age. When we went to school, I was in Mexico and Spain, all of our textbooks were in Spanish. And especially in Spain, they would translate everything. So Okteto, with a C, not with a K, is this all way in Spanish to translate the word byte. Like in megabytes and gigabytes. Because it's 8, so Okteto. So we say, okay, Okteto, but for Kubernetes, put a K on it, because it's cool. So we put the K of Okteto. Nobody liked the name. We're like, okay, but we have to send this application. We have to have a name. Let's just pick that for now. We'll change it later. And the .com was available. And the GitHub organization was available. So we're like, okay, I'm going to buy this domain, get the GitHub organization. Later we'll change it, whatever. And the name stuck. And we didn't have to pay. We had to pay $10 to get the domain, because we didn't have any money back then. And and the rest is history. Like, we keep using the name. We got into Y Combinator. And that was the beginning of really the company as a company, as this company with like global ambitions, and not just kind of like an open source project that we were building while thinking about what to do.
No, absolutely. What a story. Even the part that it all makes sense at the end, because I knew you kept on talking about Okteto, and I was like, Okteto, like, that must be 8, that must be the octopus or anything like that. And then it all tied up to the point of, hey, it came from byte and all that. It's amazing. Okteto, Okteto.
And it's not easy to pronounce, but it's easy to spell. And it's, I hope, eventually be very recognizable. And the other thing, you're very geeky and niche, but because Kubernetes is such a long name, within the community, people spell it K8S. So the 8 is also like a number that in the Kubernetes community means things. So it's kind of like a good way for us to be like, hey, we're part of the community. We're building this for us. And I like it. It's super geeky, but it kind of makes sense. And I like that it's a wink to our Spanish-speaking background, because that's also something that is not common. Like, Latin America is a very large population, Spain as well, but we're not super well represented in tech. So it was kind of nice to have this kind of like wink to like, hey, we're from Spanish speaking countries, so our name kind of winks to our heritage. I like that a lot as well.
No, I mean, yeah, you definitely found a lot of inspiration, a lot of ways to make things work. I feel like from your engineering mind, that's something that really explains how engineers think about stuff. Is even the part that you're saying that you didn't really have an idea going into it, but then you found like the team came first, and then the idea came after, and then there's like different pivots and everything. Is that you definitely embody some sort of, hey, it will work out at the end attitude, if that makes any sense, right? And I definitely share a lot of that, having worked on a lot of different projects and companies that share that attitude of, hey, it will work out at the end. That's what makes Okteto special today, I guess. One thing that a lot of people think about is, I mean, we kind of described like a lot of origins and how Okteto came to be and everything. But how would you describe it to a dev today? What is Okteto? I absolutely got the fortunate chance of playing around with it, looking into it a little bit. Nice. But describe to me, what is Okteto for somebody who codes, who could write a for loop, for example. What is Okteto?
Yeah, of course. So Okteto, the best way to describe this is Okteto is a platform that gives every engineer on a team their own copy of production. Like, you have a dev environment that looks like production. It has the same services. It runs on the same infrastructure. It has the same configuration than production. Smaller scale, typically. That is fully automated. You run one command, Okteto deploy, or you click one button on our UI, on our dashboard, and Okteto will do everything it takes to create that environment. Build containers, create cloud databases, retrieve credentials for you to like access, a private NPM, create the accounts, create the Kubernetes resources. Everything that you normally have to do by hand when you're building a cloud native application, we do automatically. And the key here for us is it looks like production. Because what we've seen is that a lot of developers have their homebrewed local installations. It works. But then they have to spend a lot of time either on CI or on something like staging or sometimes production, troubleshooting things because they're so different from their local setups that a lot of the things that you're not thinking about, latency, local host versus distributed, security models, data, is something that traditionally is very hard to replicate locally. So we automate all of that. It's very focused, our solution today, on people building microservice-based applications. Especially most of our customers are building apps that include, Kubernetes or Docker, something on AWS, GCP, Azure, third-party APIs, maybe legacy systems, right? It's for like applications that are complex. One of our first customers, which was Monday.com, funny enough, because it's competition from Atlassian, came to us because they were like, hey, our system is too complex. Our developers spend a lot of time trying to run it locally. Our laptops are no longer powerful enough to run everything we need locally. We need a remote solution. And they came to us. We worked with them. They are still one of our biggest customers. And that's what we solved. So it's something that is not really a problem, for me on like a small side project, but it is a problem for pretty much every software team at scale that I know, that I've worked at, that I've had friends working at. Like, every time I pitch this to anybody, like a team of like more than 10 people, they're like, oh yeah, I have a problem. Oh yeah, it's super hard getting data, trying to figure it out. Hey, a single staging environment that we all have to share, a single testing environment we all have to share. Like, my goal is to kind of get away from there and move everybody to this world of ephemeral environments that look like production, but that when you're developing, they feel like it's your laptop. Like, one of the first things we built was this system to do things like code synchronization, remote debugging, remote terminal, because I want it so that when you're developing Okteto, I don't want you to realize that it's a remote environment. You open VS Code, you open IntelliJ, whatever you like, you're writing code as usual, but now the changes are applied on this remote environment. And that's the big difference. It frees your computer from having to run all these things. It frees your mind from having to worry about running all these components. So I hope that this allows you to focus on your thing. Like if you're building an AI tool, I want you to spend all the time on the AI part and not on how do I get a database running? Where do I get a training set from? How do I get access to our AWS account? Like all those things are, if you have to spend time on that, that's a waste of valuable time. It's a waste of attention. It's a waste of like brain cycles, and those should be automated away. And that is what we do. One click, and you have a fully configured environment for yourself that you can share if you want. You can show it to your customers. You can show it to early adopters. It's running online, so it's available. It's secure. You can lock it down if you need, but we do a lot more, especially for like larger teams. Large organizations love Okteto because they can also like control this configuration centrally. So they can kind of create a configuration for all their developers. They can choose which accounts you can use, which resources you have access to, which ones you don't have access to. But it's all about making it more efficient for everybody.
No, I mean, coming from somebody, me, who's seen probably 8 different implementations of preview links. I've worked on so many different projects that everybody has implemented preview links at least once, just because, or even like, what is it? We had to go through ngrok. We had to expose our local through ngrok so that people could use it. So I'm sure I'm throwing out a lot of examples. Or the amount of times that you run Docker Compose and you hope that it runs, and it's like either there's some dangling container that's there, or your computer just doesn't run anymore at that point to be like, oh yeah, sure, bump your Docker memory to like 16 gigs, even though your machine only has 8 gigs or whatever it is. Like those are all stuff that
and all those things is something like everything you mentioned. That's how you solve it today with Okteto, and I've done that before. But that's something that a seasoned developer gets. Tell that to a front-end developer who's specialized on React. They'd be like, I don't care what this Docker thing is. I don't know what this ngrok thing is. Like, why are you bugging me with this? I want to work on the user experience. So having this packaged experience where all of this is taken care of automatically, that one person, the platform team in your company sets it up for you, that for me is the value, is having this, I'm fighting this battle of like, hey, we don't need to go to a point where like everybody needs to understand everything. That's a waste of time. As our industry matures, as more people join our profession, we're going to have more and more specialists. So the idea of like these engineers that understand every single thing of the stack is not realistic anymore. Like I don't want at Okteto, we use Okteto internally, of course. I don't want our front-end devs who are like really good at like experiences at like React, at design. I don't want them like losing time because they're trying to figure out how to configure access to a Kubernetes cluster. That's for like the backend engineers. Then yes. And the same way, backend engineers, I don't want them spending too much time trying to figure out how do I get, the front end to work with React and with dependencies and what is this like NPM thing or yarn. No, I want them to have access to their own copy of our front end so they can build the APIs that are needed, but in a way that they can focus on that as well. And they can be experts in Kubernetes. The front end team is expert on React. And then everybody gets to work on the area they're good at. And together we ship this wonderful software. And that idea is what I'm hoping that we can help the world adopt. Mm-hmm. And our tool can be the way to kind of like guide that adoption. That for me would be the ideal.
Yeah, that's awesome. The way, if you would allow me marketing your product for half a second, the way I would describe it is if you're an engineer at work and you've said these words, it works on my machine, then you will find a use case for Okteto. If you've ever said it works on my machine ever, you will find a reason why Okteto is there.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. The other is like, if you ever like cross your fingers that, hey, I hope this works in prod, then your team needs Okteto.
That's so funny. You didn't even pay me to say this, by the way. I just know that people say that. Maybe you should pay me. I'm kidding.
Maybe I should pay you. No, you're right. No,
one thing that's really, really funny and not funny, but really cool at the same time is that when you're talking about the stuff that you're building, like the code synchronization and then a couple of that stuff, the geeky part of me, of course, I'm an engineer at the end of the day, is how in the world is it built? And of course, you don't have to tell me everything. There's, I'm sure, a lot of IP behind all of it. But the way I was describing this is that there's dev tools, product engineering, and all that. Product engineering is you build stuff and then people could see it visually, for example. You build a lot of components and people could see it. But then when you talk about building dev tools and building more behind the scenes stuff, is how is it built? Because there's a layer of abstraction that we don't usually see, like even from your experience of working really low level, like maybe like the C# and all that kind of stuff, like the ASP.NET, those frameworks. So for Okteto, maybe what you can tell me per se is, how is it built? Do you write a lot of like YAML behind the scenes? Is there a lot of TOML, or is that even like no YAML at all? Like those are the questions I'm so confused and I'm geeking about right now.
I should have brought my YAML engineer t-shirt. I have one of our friends at a company and they build this t-shirt. Robusta is like YAML engineer. It's a lot of different things. So Okteto has two main components. Three. One is the IDE plugin that's optional. The CLI, which is the main way like people interact with our product. And then there is a component you install on the cluster that you install on Kubernetes. And really that component does a lot of like the heavy lifting. This component is a mix of Kubernetes automation, our own automation, some of our IP, but also a lot of like glue between different parts of Kubernetes. Like Kubernetes is a great platform, but it's not meant for like, human consumption. It's meant for like automation. So we build this abstraction level on top, very opinionated, to give you an experience where like, hey, you go to this dashboard, we only show you the information that we think you want to see. And then if you want, you can always access Kubernetes and dig as deep as you need. But really a lot of like the magic we offer is automation and abstraction, so that you can build these workflows that your team needs. Like, hey, I need to deploy a container. I need to create a queue in the dev account in AWS. And I need to get data from this legacy system and put that data, I don't know, as an S3 bucket for my test to read, like all those things. So a lot of what we build is kind of like this workflow that automates Kubernetes, cloud access, provisioning, and the abstraction, so that if you don't care, you don't see it. And that's very important in developer tools, is building, and the hardest thing too, is building the abstraction. Like making a kind of your line in the sand of like, this is where I think you care about. This is what I think you don't care about. And then build the right scale bulbs so that for that 10% who cares about it, okay, this is how you get it. That's how we see it. Our stack is a mix of like React in the front end, a lot of Go in the back end, a lot of like integration with the Go SDK, and all the other. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, or your listeners, the whole thing, Helm charts, admission controllers, configuration, secret management. But a lot of what we do is really, for me, the value we provide to our customers is this abstraction and automation, so they don't have to deal with it. Like you said, there are so many companies that implement preview links internally, and they should not be wasting their time on that. They should be using a commercial solution that just works. Ours does that. It gives you preview links, it gives you remote dev environments, it gives you staging and test environments, and it's all in the service of this abstraction that is, say, available for all your developers.
Yeah, this is great because it really helps understand, of course, like what are the features of Okteto, but then you kind of satisfy my itch of like, well, how is it built? What is it? I'm guessing that there's a part behind it where it's like a lot of scripting, a lot of ways of automating this stuff where you're taking some data, putting it somewhere else. I mean, I'm talking very high level, but even the fact that I'm assuming you're alluding that the CLI is written in Go, if I got that correctly.
It is, and the CLI is open source. The CLI works. You can, I mean, if anybody of your listeners is interested, you can check it out. The CLI is open source. The CLI is kind of like the single player mode. And then our commercial solution, which is what goes in the cluster, that is meant once you want to scale to like a full team.
Gotcha. That clarification is very, very useful to understand that.
Yeah, but you can check it out. And I mean, we have a lot of contributors. A lot of people use Okteto with their own kind of clusters, not with ours. That works as well. A lot of like big companies. Actually, it's really funny when you discover companies that are using your product. But because we're using open source and because it kind of just works for them, they never talk to you, so you don't know. And then when they like reach out, like, oh, this company that I know uses Okteto to build the product I use. Like, oh, that's kind of cool. Can I talk to you? And then you kind of meet them, and then it's like all fun.
No, of course. And then it's like, be a sponsor. And I'm kidding. Those are all like the ecosystem of open source software. That's always the fun part, to be like, they depend on you, even though you don't really know that they depend on you so
I
hard.
know
So that is
that's
so great. That is
one
absolutely
of my
amazing.
favorite things about open source, and also some of the scariest things about
Yeah,
open
of course,
source.
of course.
Because there's all these like super prominent open source projects that are maintained by like one person.
Mm-hmm.
There's one person that keeps the whole thing running, and you're like, oh my god. If that person gets fed up, if they're like, like table flip, I'm out. You're like, we're all screwed.
Yeah, shout out to that XKCD picture.
Yes.
With all these like Tetris building blocks everywhere, and there's like that one thin one just sitting there, and it's like maintained by one person, and like just holding up the whole internet at the end. So I'm sure it's so great
exactly.
that
That's exactly what I was thinking about. I'm glad you got it.
That's so great that you're able to experience it and share your experience with a lot of that. I think one thing that's really interesting about this, because we're talking about Okteto and we're talking about how you found it and everything, is people who listen to it, I feel like a lot of people they want to do stuff. They want to be the beginning of something. They want to, and I absolutely embrace it. Me, myself, I tell myself that all the time. So for me to ask you this question of what did you start with? You started off with a team of people, so that's great. You got the idea coming through. And then next, when we talk about incorporations, when we talk about what else did you need, like maybe on a very low level, like on the more lower level side is, I'm a person. I want to be building stuff. Like, what's my step here? I got my team. I got the idea. What's next?
That's a really good question, because I think that a lot of people try to go big before they need to. If you have the team and you have the idea, that's all you need. You should start. Build. Like, one thing I learned from Y Combinator that was really good, and it's really hard. It's simple, but it's hard to actually apply it, is the idea of like, build something people want. There's a ton of problems that are very meaningful, but most of them nobody really cares about. And they're not willing to put money on them. So the sooner you figure out, hey, the problem I'm trying to build is there. And this is if you're thinking of a company. If it's a hobby, if it's a project, do whatever you want. I've built so many things just for myself. Like I built this Alexa bot that just tells me when the bus is coming, and it's hard coded to the bus I take, because I just love that shit. And I was like, yeah, if you want to do something like that, and I have no commercial aspirations, I think it has like 3 users and it's good. But if you're thinking of commercial, right? The sooner you answer that question, if there's somebody willing to pay for this, if there's somebody willing to stop what they're doing and change the way they're doing things, because this problem is so important, the sooner you realize that, the better you're going to be off. So it's very important to be able to build something before anything else. You don't need a website. You don't need to set up a corporation don't set up your company until you have either somebody that wants to pay you or investors. Then you need a company, and then there's Stripe Atlas, there's Clarky, where you can create a company in like 20 minutes with like $100. It's super simple. But do that, because as soon as you do it, then you have tax liabilities, then you have to file records. There's some work on like the running the company. You have to keep books. So postpone that the most you can. Like, what I recommend everybody is, like, if you have a team and you have an idea, go talk to a bunch of people. Try to figure out, hey, are you willing to pay for this? How expensive is this problem for you? If you have to build a prototype, build something simple and show it to people as soon as possible. Because I know there are people who wait for the perfect moment. They'll wait for years until they feel something is ready. And in my experience, it's very unlikely that what you build the first time is going to be good. Some people get lucky. People are really good at this. If you have experience, maybe, right? But showing it to somebody, learning how to build things in a way that is iteration, you have to understand what matters for the problem you're solving. If it's consumer, then maybe you need a very polished demo. Sure. If it's like a dev tool, if you're like, developers are more tolerant to like shoddy UIs, to a point. Okay, maybe just like a CLI with some scripts. But you need to build that muscle of, hey, start, validate, and then once you have a good feeling, then figure out, hey, is this something I want to dedicate the next 10 years of my life? Do I want to build this as a commercial effort, as full-time? Now there's so many avenues. You don't have to go the VC route if you don't want. I think I like, we're a VC-backed company. I'm very fond of my investors. We work really well together. But I also understand that not every problem needs VC money to be solved. A lot of companies that I know that raise rounds would be much better if they had other types of funding, because not everybody's going to be $1 billion companies, but you can make a really nice living if you have a $5-10 million company. That's kind of life changing kind of money. So before thinking of that, going back to is get it done, build something, have somebody use it, try to get them to use it, friends are tough. Try to get strangers to use it. I prefer strangers because friends will always be like, oh yeah, this is really cool. Okay, are you going to use it? Well, no, but it's because I'm busy, whatever. And unless you're good at reading them, and be like, okay, because you don't care about this, or because you don't think it's good. Unless you have founder friends. Founder friends are good because they know the pain, and they will tell you, no, that sucks. I will never use that. But if you don't have founder friends, just build it, put it out there, try to get somebody to use it, and talk to them. That's very important. I love that phrase of fall in love with the problem, not with the solution. Because if you care about a problem enough, talk to a bunch of people who have that problem, then you'll find a solution. But postpone fundraising, postpone kind of having a company until you have a good certainty. Okay, I'm building this. We did it early on, and it created kind of more paperwork than needed. Once there's money, you want that, having a company is an abstraction layer. At least in the US, it helps kind of separate where the liability of the company ends and when your personal one starts. If you have a customer and they pay you directly, not the company, then you're liable if something goes wrong. You can't dissolve the company. You cannot dissolve yourself. So that's important. It's a tool. But before doing that, I would make sure of that. But once you're ready to build a company, go one of the services. Try to do the most standard. If you're gonna go the VC route, use Clerkey or Atlas Stripe. Set it up at Delaware. 10 million stocks. Use the super standard, because anything you do that is not standard is gonna become a problem later on. It's gonna be something you're gonna have to explain and negotiate and probably redo, especially if you're going the VC way. All the boring stuff should be as boring as possible, as standard as possible, so that the one thing you're innovating is the one that you're focusing the coolness on.
Yeah, I just want to say keep on saying thank you. Every time you mention one more thing, I just keep on saying thank you in every aspect, because what is this? Delaware C Corp. It's a term that people say a lot because you don't get VC money if you're not a Delaware C Corp. You could Google this, you could look into that, but that's a very American, startup-y Silicon Valley kind of term. It's not just in Silicon Valley, of course, but Delaware C Corp, that's something that I've heard so many times in my years of...
I had no idea what it was before Okteto. It's one of those things that I wish somebody, maybe I'll do it someday, put a guide of startup funding for engineers.
No,
because
of
there's
course.
all these boring things that you have to learn, finance. Because one thing that people forget about startups is you're running a business. And there's all these business things you have to worry about. Taxes, licenses,
trademarks, copyrights.
Investment, bank accounts, liability, business insurance.
Salaries
salaries, payroll processors. How do you pay your vendors? Are you going to get a company credit card? None of this has to do with innovation. But if you don't take care of these things, you can't run a company, because you're going to get in trouble. And especially once you get external investors, they don't want to carry the risk of hey, what if somebody sues you because your software didn't work, and because your contract didn't have a clause where it says that you're not liable if the software doesn't perform as expected. Then they go after you. And if you didn't set up the LLC or the C Corp, then they're going to go after you, your personal assets, not the company assets. All of these things are very boring, but if things go wrong, they can make it go really wrong. So it's something that's very important. And, big piece of advice, if you're thinking of getting American investment, like VC investment especially, which is what I have more experience with, set up your company in the US. Otherwise, unless, like, if you're in Canada, you're in Mexico, if you're in Europe, unless your first main source of revenue is going to be like from your region, which is, is valid. There's now funds everywhere. If that's not the case, like setting up the company in the US, you can set up a company in the US even if you don't live in the US. If you don't have a visa, it doesn't matter. Anybody can set up a company in the US. It makes things simpler from an investment perspective. Otherwise, you're going to have to like create a more complex structure with like a company in one country that owns a company in another country. And every time you do that, it's one more tax law you have to understand. There's one more accounting you have to account for. And it's another hour of your day gone in boring things and not in cool innovation.
If you think one country's tax laws are complicated, imagine 2, imagine 4 of them, imagine 8 of them. This is also great. One thing, what's kind of cool is that I do have a friend who got into the recent batch of YC.
Oh, nice.
Going into it.
Exciting.
And the terms that they talk about, of course, the clerkies, the strap outs, the deal also, there's a lot of those terms that come up. So when you mention that, what I'm trying to say is that you're mentioning very modern ways of approaching, at least are modern, right? You're mentioning a lot of today technology, today services, today resources or founders. So I'm glad that you already pointed out a lot of those examples. To wrap this up, I think I got 2 questions left. That's been picking my brain this whole time. Like the more you're talking, there's 2 of them that kind of sat with me. The number one is that we've talked about having devs as a customer. Devs are the hardest people to please. I'm one, you're one. We're talking about
they
this.
Are.
So my question about that is like, what is one of the craziest like feature requests that devs ask you? I'm asking this because there's normal people and then there's engineers. So I don't know if you have like any fun thing to shout out in the sense of we got asked this once and
I got so many, but
nobody else would ask this if it wasn't like a dev, if it wasn't like an engineer.
I think that in our case, what's crazy about devs is not the requests, because I think like we're building a tool for developers, so when they ask for things, they tend to be things that they suffer, right? But 2 things that are crazy and happens a lot. One is the super specific to their stack feature request. Like, we need an integration for, this like IBM mainframe that has no API, but we need to get data from there. And I'm like, but nobody else in the world uses that. Yeah, but we need it. And the other is and every developer, myself included, we always fall for this. We all know it's not easy, but we all think it's super easy. And you get these requests. Hey, can you implement this API? I'm like, okay, yeah, thank you. You know what? We're going to think about it maybe in next quarter. And they're like, no, but it's like super easy. It's just like 5 lines of code. Like all you have to do is like this. And I'm like, that's not true. I know that's not true. Like, why are you going in that direction? And they say with this authority, and I'm like, dude, you work for product. You know how hard it is to even like do a small feature. There's complications on like testing, quality, shipping, maintenance. It's not just like the line of code. That's something we get a lot. Running Okteto on like very esoteric platforms. Like we had this company, I will not name names, but they had their own custom version of Kubernetes. They forked Kubernetes, they made some changes and they built it. I'm sure they had good reasons. And they're like, hey, when are you going to support this version of Kubernetes? And I'm like, that version doesn't exist. Oh, right. No, it's an internal version we built, a few years ago, whatever. And I'm like, never. What do you expect me to like do? Like, how can I support this unavailable version that only you have access to? That was a funny one. Because they asked like as if it was like something that it was like broadly available. And maybe the person didn't realize it was like a custom thing. But I was like, that number doesn't make sense. Like Kubernetes is 1.20 something. You're asking me for like version 3. There's no version 3. So that was a funny one. That was a funny one.
I'm just so glad I asked this question. I've been just dying every time you mention any one of these. Like, not saying that I've been guilty of any of those, but it's something that was so relatable to be like, hey, maybe it was like a really early eng that just joined that team, and they were like, we have this package that they probably internally named it as Kubernetes. They probably done something like that, where they were like, oh yeah, that's probably the standard. That, and for them to reach out to you, like I want to give them a big respect, right? To be like, the people that
100%.
reach out are the people that are the bravest in the community. So
if I've learned one thing about, when I moved to like Bay Area and working on Silicon Valley kind of startups, is asking is so powerful, because at least in my experience, most people in the startups are like super eager to please. Like they want to help their customers. That's why we do this, right? We're very close to the customers. Like I get emails from our customers all the time. I answer them. I get tweets or X, whatever it's called now. X's. I don't know. Tweets. So it's very powerful. Like if somebody sends me a feature request, even if it's the craziest thing, I will have spent 5 minutes thinking about it and be like, is this crazy? Or maybe I'm not seeing the big picture. Like maybe there's something here. So anybody who's listening, like, yeah, ask away. Like that's what like all these projects have, like issue trackers and feedback forms, or you can like file bugs on or discussion boards. Because you never know, you might be into something, and even if it's something internal, a lot of what we've built came from our customers asking us to do. That for me is the coolest thing about developers. Is, a lot of developers are hackers, so they will, if they like your tool and your tool doesn't do something, they will try to find a way. And they've been features that we built that the initial idea came from a customer. Say, hey, we tried to do X, we couldn't, so we did this instead. Check it out. I was like, oh, that's so cool. Can we do that? We're gonna do that as a product. Is that okay? Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Here's the code. Whatever. It's open source. That is really cool, and that's one thing that honestly, like, I don't know how founders in other verticals do this, but I love that about developer tools. Is like developers are very transparent when they like you and they don't, and they give you that, like. I think you can build an entire roadmap. You have to be good at listening and to whom, but you can build an entire roadmap by just like looking at your feature requests and like people file, and as long as it's clear, like you as a founder need to work hard on the vision of your product, making it very clear to your users, and then the feature request will come, and you can build your roadmap just on that, which I love. It's so cool. You're building together. And solving real problems and less of like the dreamy things. That is really cool. Getting them to pay for it, I can speak an hour on like selling to developers is the hardest thing.
Can I speak to your rep, please? Can I speak to somebody else that doesn't do the techie stuff? Trust me, I've been on both.
Who owns the budget? So. Who's the decision maker? Can I speak to your manager? Can I speak to your manager's manager?
And even them could probably not sign off.
Yeah, I know. That's the hardest thing.
That's so fun. But
I learned so much about like technical sales that I'm like, oh my god.
Oh my god, yeah. One thing, I mean, all your stories are so great because I can relate to it, and I know I'm talking to an engineer when you talk about this kind of stuff. So at least on mine, I want to say thank you on that part.
No, thanks. I'm glad the engineer still comes through. I'm not more of a CEO, but I'm glad that the engineer still comes through.
Well, I mean, between us, between engineers, between devs, we were just a big circle jerk of just like people just messing around in the industry more than anything. But one thing that people will mention, at least I'll mention, is that, you have the skills of being eloquent and being able to translate your idea into communication and all of that. Talk to me about radio station when you were at Monterey.
Wow, you really research things too. That's really cool. That was one of the most fun things I've done in my life. Our school had one of the degrees you could study. It was an engineering school, but for some reason, they were expanding into like, I guess, other medias. Maybe that was like a natural extension. And they had a degree on like kind of broadcasting. I think it was broadcasting or like a specialization from like a kind of communications degree. I don't know. But they had a fully loaded like radio station in campus. And students were like invited, hey, if you want to do a show, just pitch it. And two friends and I were like, yeah, well, we had one friend that was studying a degree. So he knew how to like operate the station. Like, oh, that's really cool. He was like, yeah, like it's all these lots. Nobody is really using it. Why don't we just like do a show of like dumb things to it? Like, yeah, let's do it. So we did a show. We pitched this show to like the radio station. It was to talk about technology, can explain how technology works for like non-tech people. And it was three of us, and this friend who was like our kind of producer. And yeah, and it was like, oh yeah, of course. And they gave us like the Friday 2 p.m. slot, which is Friday at like lunchtime in Mexico. The worst possible slot, but it was a lot of fun. So for 2 years or a year and a half, every Friday we would record a show, an hour show. We'll do our research. So we had like every week like a topic, like how blockchain works, why MP3s are so much smaller than regular audio, how the internet works. Like we're trying to make it kind of like interesting, fun tech that we used. We'd never had any listeners really. It was actually a real radio. You could pick it up on an FM and also on Winamp. Back in the day, like it was like before Apple Music, before Spotify, right? It was like this URL you could get and listen. But it was really interesting because it was a really fun way to kind of exercise or build these skills of like explaining things. And it was just a blast. It was so much fun. And I don't know, it was interesting to kind of like take this side of us, so like, hey, we like technology. How do we explain this to people to get them excited and all these new things that are coming? You know, it was a very cool time in Mexico where like, because of the internet, we're kind of like catching up things. So cell phones, you know, like smartphones were more prevalent. MP3, you know, the whole iTunes revolution, internet, modern video games, new movies, like all the kind of like geeky media world. So that was fun. It was one of the more unique experiences I've had. It was very far from tech, and it was cool to work on like this. Like kudos to the school to give us access to like a professional grade radio station. Like the booth had like this like echo dampening devices and the microphones and the big headphones. The whole thing, like that was something I did not have access to. You know, now you can buy like a nice microphone for like I have one here right now, YouTube, but back then was not. So that was really cool. It was something that really like was a very wonderful experience. And if anybody gets a chance, I mean, now with podcasts, it's the same. It's a lot easier. You can do it at your house, but it was fun to kind of get the full setup. It really helps you get in the mood. Right? Like you're like, oh, we're in a station, we're in a booth, and that's why like I bought when I started like doing a lot of like recordings and videos for Okteto, I bought a nice microphone, nice camera. I think those things help you get into like the mood of like, hey, I'm recording, I'm doing this. It's something special. Let's put our energy. Let's put the right energy, the right voice, the right tone. And it helped me understand that communication is something very important. It's something that engineers, I think, in general, we need to invest more on. Is learning how to like explain your ideas. It's a huge edge. People who are good at explaining their ideas and good at like gaining like buy-in, that's what like successful founders are good at. Is like selling their idea to the world. Like I saw this quote from, I forgot who it was. I think it was like the CEO of Twitter, talking about how the hardest thing for leadership is that you have to get people to understand what you already understand. And that idea of like transmitting your ideas and convincing others, I was like, okay, anything you can do to make you better at that, you all should. So for me, the radio station was one of those things that, again, going back, like, oh yeah, that actually helped me to do this now. So that was cool.
No, I was gonna say it definitely transpires. One thing that I admire when you're telling that story is that you didn't have a single doubt in you remembering that story. You didn't have a moment where you were like, "Oh wait, what happened?" And it was clear that everything that happened just marked you, and that's something that I keep on saying.
Me. That I'm very surprised you found that, because I hadn't thought about that in a long time. Now I'm getting all these like flashbacks of like all the cool things and all the dumb things we did. But that is something that has marked me, was this idea of like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, but let's do it anyway. Within reason. Like I would not like fly a plane, but I think that's something very important. Is as all of us, is always lose that fear of like the ridicule and doing things even if you don't know what you're doing. Within reason. It's a very powerful skill. It's something I've worked on a lot to kind of. Because I think I tend to be more conservative, by nature, but I fight it and try to do all these things to push myself because that's how you grow. And that's how great things are created. Like a lot of people who are going back to your question of startups, a lot of people are just afraid of starting because they're like, hey, what if nobody likes it? What if like it's a dumb idea? And then they spend too much time polishing something that maybe it's a bad idea, but because you were not exposed to it, you didn't get a chance to pivot, you didn't get a chance to polish. So it's very important to like throw yourself in the arena, which is what we're saying now, and just do things and face them. And yeah, most things will not work, but you don't need all of them to work. If you find one that works, then you're done. Then that's it. You have one thing to obsess over the next 10 years.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So, Ramiro, that is absolute gold. Everything you've shared today, absolute gold left and right. You could learn from every single sentence that you mentioned. So, on behalf of myself, I want to say big thank you for doing that. But before that, where could people find Okteto and where can people find Ramiro?
Yeah, so Okteto, go to okteto.com, okteto.com. If you're interested in like talking more about developer experience, if you're having the kind of problems we talk about, if you say this works on my machine a lot, I would love to talk to you. We have a special offer for listeners of your podcast. If you send me an email to like podcast@okteto.com, we can set up a free session and just talk about where you are in terms of dev experience and what you want to accomplish. And I'm also very active on Twitter. So if you look for like R Berrelleza, like my last name, on Twitter, I'm always there chatting about a bunch of things. A lot of tech, a lot of food, a lot of like SF stuff. But I'm there and I'm always looking forward to talking to more people who care about the world of like just the craft of software, startups, and just making, dev experience more joyful for everybody.
Yeah, and of course, all the links will be shared in the description notes, so you can definitely find all of that. But I came out seeing it from my end, from everybody's end, as your stories were absolutely amazing throughout the whole part. And the one thing I can't say more enough is what is it? Muchas gracias de Perry. I think from me, from everyone, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing you.
De nada. Thank you very much, Perry. It was amazing. I had a lot of fun. I'm really glad you did all this research. There was a lot of things I hadn't thought about for a long time, but it's always cool to, share them and realize how slowly things add up together and get you to a point. It was really exciting. So thanks so much. I hope your audience has as much fun as I had, and I'm looking forward to future episodes.
And we'll definitely keep an eye on Okteto throughout your whole journey as well. So, signing off from our end, I just want to thank you to everyone listening, and I will catch you guys on the next one. And that was Ramiro Berrelleza, founder and CEO of Okteto. Go check him out at all the links shared in the show notes down below. Once again, thank you for listening to Podcast Written by a Software Engineer. Don't forget to follow the show and leave us a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It's completely free. And if you want to pick up some swag, go check it out at perrytiu.com/shop. I'll catch you on the next one. Big love.